My name is Bill, and I am 29 years old. I was sitting at our family dinner table when my father looked me straight in the eyes and said those words I never thought I would hear. "Leave the key, and do not come back." My mother just stared and nodded. "This house was never yours." My sister Julia handed me a suitcase already packed. They erased me room by room, memory by memory. I stood on the sidewalk that night, homeless, until 2 weeks later when the bank called. Before I continue my story, let me know where you are watching from, and hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more stories about family betrayal and unexpected justice. Life before everything fell apart was what most people would call normal. I worked as a software engineer at a tech company in Boston, making good money and enjoying the stability of a career I had built over 7 years. My relationship with my parents, Frank and Linda, seemed fine on the surface. We had dinner together 3 times a week, celebrated holidays as a family, and maintained the appearance of a close-knit unit to the outside world. But there was always this undercurrent of distance, especially with my father. He was a practical man, an accountant who measured success in numbers and tangible assets. My mother was quieter, always deferring to him on major decisions. She would smile and nod during conversations, but rarely offered her own opinions when my father was present. I often wondered what she really thought about things, but any attempt to have a one-on-one conversation with her was usually interrupted by my father needing her for something. My younger sister Julia and I used to be close. Growing up, we were partners in crime, building forts in the backyard, and defending each other when one of us got in trouble. She was 4 years younger than me, and I always felt protective of her. But over the past few years, especially after our grandfather Harold passed away, something shifted. She began avoiding me, making excuses to leave the room when I entered, cutting our conversations short. The house itself was special. A 2-story Victorian in the suburbs of Boston, with wraparound porches and intricate woodwork that you just do not see in modern homes. It had been in our family for 3 generations. My grandfather Harold had purchased it after building his construction business from nothing. He was a self-made man in every sense, starting as a laborer and eventually owning one of the largest construction companies in Massachusetts. Harold was more than just my grandfather. He was my mentor, my friend. When I was a boy, he would take me fishing at the lake house on weekends, teaching me how to cast a line and wait patiently for the fish to bite. Sometimes we would just drive around in his old pickup truck, and he would point out buildings his company had constructed, telling me stories about the challenges they faced and how they overcame them. I remember how his eyes would light up when he talked about problem solving and creating something that would last. There was a special connection between us that I never quite had with my own father. Harold encouraged my interest in computers and engineering, buying me my first programming books and desktop computer when I was 12. My father had wanted me to follow him into accounting, but Harold told me to follow my passion. 2 years ago, Harold passed away at the age of 82. That was when things began to change in our family. The first sign was when his office in our house was locked up. My father said they needed time to sort through his papers, but months passed, and still nobody was allowed in there. Whenever I brought up memories of grandfather, the conversation would awkwardly shift to something else. I started noticing my parents whispering about papers and legal issues. When I would enter a room, they would suddenly stop talking or change the subject. At first, I thought it was just part of the grieving process, that dealing with a deceased loved one's affairs was always complicated. Despite the growing distance at home, my professional life was thriving. I had recently been promoted to senior engineer, leading a team developing healthcare software. The work was fulfilling but demanding, often requiring late nights and occasional weekends. In retrospect, perhaps my focus on career advancement gave my family the space they needed to execute their plan without me noticing. Even though I had my own apartment closer to downtown, I still contributed significantly to the family finances. Every month, I transferred $1,000 to my parents' account to help with the mortgage and property taxes on the family home. It was something I had started doing after college, a way to show gratitude for their support during my education. My father never acknowledged these payments directly, just a brief nod when I would mention the transfer had gone through. I never questioned continuing these payments. After all, I assumed the house would stay in the family, perhaps one day becoming a place where I could raise my own family, continuing the legacy my grandfather had built. How wrong I was about everything. The first real cracks in our family facade began appearing about 8 months after Grandfather Harold died. Small things at first, so subtle I almost missed them. Family meetings suddenly happening when I was at work. Text message threads that excluded me. Dinner conversations that abruptly changed topic when I walked in. Then Thomas Walker started showing up at our family dinners. A slick corporate attorney with perfect teeth and a condescending smile. Thomas was apparently an old college friend of my father. He specialized in estate planning and property law, my father explained casually, as if having a lawyer at our Sunday dinner was completely normal. What was not normal was how Thomas would glance at me during these meals, studying me when he thought I was not looking, and the way conversations would shift to vague pleasantries whenever I asked specific questions about what he was helping my parents with. I will never forget the night I overheard them in the kitchen. I had come home unexpectedly after a work event ended early. The three of them, my father, mother, and Thomas, were huddled at the kitchen table, papers spread out before them. "We need to find a way around the legal barriers," my father was saying. "The inheritance rights are clear, but there must be some way too." Thomas interrupted, lowering his voice. "There are options, Frank, but we need to be careful. If Bill suspects anything." They went silent when they heard my footsteps. My mother hurriedly gathered the papers, while my father stood up, blocking my view of the table. "Just discussing some tax issues," he said with a forced smile. "Nothing for you to worry about." I nodded and went upstairs, but that night, I could not sleep. What legal barriers were they talking about? What inheritance rights? And why was my name mentioned? A few weeks later, I came home late after a coding marathon at work. The house was dark except for a sliver of light coming from my grandfather's office. The door was ajar, unusual since it had been kept locked since his death. I quietly approached and peered inside. My father was there, rifling through a filing cabinet, pulling out folders and scanning documents with a portable scanner connected to his laptop. I stepped back before he could see me, my heart racing. Whatever was happening, my instincts told me it was not right. The next day, Julia could barely look at me during breakfast. When I asked her if everything was okay, she mumbled something about being tired and quickly left the table. The guilt in her eyes was unmistakable. A month later, I learned through a casual comment from our neighbor that there had been a formal reading of my grandfather's will at our house. I had never been informed, much less invited. When I confronted my parents about this, my father dismissed it as a small, unimportant formality. "Just some minor bequest to old friends. Nothing that concerned you," he said, waving his hand dismissively. My mother added, "We did not want to bother you with it, knowing how busy you are with work." Their explanations did not add up. If it was so unimportant, why exclude me? If they were concerned about my busy schedule, why not at least give me the option to attend? Then came the phone call from Uncle David, my father's brother who lived in California. He rarely called, so I was surprised to hear from him. "Bill," he said hesitantly, "I heard about the inheritance situation. Just wanted to say, I think you should fight for what's rightfully yours." Harold would have wanted. My father must have walked in on his end, because he suddenly changed topics, talking about the weather in San Diego before quickly ending the call. The inheritance situation? Fight for what was rightfully mine? I was completely in the dark, but increasingly certain that something significant was being hidden from me. The atmosphere at home became suffocating. Family photos that included me began disappearing from the walls, replaced by pictures of just my parents and Julia. My suggestions for family activities were repeatedly turned down with flimsy excuses. I spent nights staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together the fragments of conversation, the strange behaviors, the growing sense that I was being systematically removed from the family narrative. What had I done to deserve this? Was there something about my grandfather's death that I did not know? Was there a secret I was not privy to? The house that had once been my sanctuary was becoming a place of tension and unspoken hostility. Little did I know that the worst was yet to come, and that the foundation of everything I believed about my family was built on quicksand. The situation escalated rapidly over the next few months. My father began openly criticizing my career choices, something he had never done before. "All that time wasted staring at computer screens," he said during one dinner. "You could have joined my accounting firm, built something real instead of this digital nonsense." My mother, once my quiet defender, now sat in silence, eyes fixed on her plate. Julia would find excuses to eat elsewhere when I was home. The house felt like a battlefield with invisible tripwires everywhere. The real turning point came when I discovered a copy of what appeared to be my grandfather's will in my father's home office. I had not been snooping intentionally. I was looking for a stapler and opened the wrong drawer. The document was right on top, with my grandfather's name clearly visible. What caught my eye immediately were the markings on the document, areas of text that appeared to have been modified, with different fonts and spacing. One section with my name had a line through it, with handwritten notes in the margin. I took photos with my phone, my hands shaking. Whatever was happening, this document was at the heart of it. When I confronted my father that evening, showing him the photos, his face turned crimson with rage. "You went through my private papers?" he shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "This is exactly why you cannot be trusted." I stood my ground. What is going on with grandfather's will? Why does it look like it has been altered? And why was I excluded from the reading? My mother entered the room, alarmed by the shouting. When she saw what was happening, her face went pale. "This is our house," my father said, jabbing a finger toward my chest. "Our business. You have no right to question how we handle family matters." "Your house?" I asked, incredulous. "I have been contributing to the mortgage for years. Grandfather bought this house. What do you mean, your house?" He laughed, a cold, dismissive sound that sent chills down my spine. "Your grandfather understood who deserved to inherit his legacy. And it was not the grandson who abandoned family tradition for some computer fantasy." The argument escalated until I found myself being ordered to leave. Not permanently, not yet, but my father made it clear that I had crossed a line. I spent that night at a friend's apartment, trying to make sense of what was happening. The next day, I began gathering information. I reached out to the law firm mentioned on the will document, only to be told they could not discuss the matter with me. I searched online for information about contesting wills, inheritance laws in Massachusetts, anything that might help me understand. I also started collecting evidence of my financial contributions to the house, bank statements showing years of transfers to my parents' account, text messages discussing home repairs I had paid for. It was becoming clear that I might need to protect myself legally. A chance encounter with Grace, our elderly neighbor who had known my grandfather for decades, provided another puzzle piece. "Oh, those meetings," she said when I casually mentioned the visitors to our house. "All those men in suits coming and going. Your grandfather would never have approved of Thomas Walker, you know. Harold always said he was a shark who would sell his own mother for the right price." I pressed for more information, and Grace revealed that she had seen my father, mother, and Thomas entering and leaving our house at odd hours, often carrying stacks of documents. Once, she had overheard my father on his phone in the backyard, saying something about removing Bill's name from the papers. Around the same time, I discovered that $15,000 had been withdrawn from a joint bank account I shared with my parents, an account originally set up by my grandfather for family emergencies. When I asked about it, my father claimed it was for essential house repairs, but no such repairs were evident. The betrayal cut deep. These were the people I had trusted implicitly my entire life, the people who were supposed to have my best interests at heart. Yet here they were, conspiring behind my back, possibly altering legal documents, and treating me like an outsider in my own family. I began to see patterns in their behavior that I had previously dismissed. How my accomplishments were minimized while Julia's were celebrated. How family heirlooms that should have been shared were quietly channeled to her. How my father had always maintained tight control over family finances, even refusing to discuss the details of my grandfather's estate. What hurt most was my mother's complicity. She had always been the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over conflicts and ensured everyone felt valued. Now she was a silent participant in whatever scheme they were executing, unable or unwilling to stand up for me. The tension in the house became unbearable. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Doors were locked that had never been locked before. Julia avoided being alone with me entirely, as if afraid she might accidentally reveal something. I felt like I was living with strangers, wearing the faces of people I had once loved and trusted. And somewhere in the background, the ghost of my grandfather seemed to watch it all unfold, powerless to intervene, as his family tore itself apart over whatever legacy he had left behind. The evening it all came to a head began deceptively like any other family dinner. I arrived home from work to find my mother cooking my favorite meal, pot roast with roasted potatoes and carrots, the recipe my grandfather had taught her years ago. The table was set with the good china, which we typically only used for special occasions. Something is up, I thought immediately. This elaborate dinner setup was too deliberate, especially given the frigid atmosphere in the house lately. My father was already seated at the head of the table, dressed in a button-up shirt rather than his usual casual attire. Julia sat beside him, her eyes red as if she had been crying. My mother busied herself in the kitchen, avoiding eye contact when I offered to help. We all sat down, and an uncomfortable silence fell over the table as my mother served the food. The only sounds were the clink of silverware against plates, and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, the one Harold had restored himself. "So," I said, attempting to break the tension, "any special occasion I should know about?" My father cleared his throat. "Actually, Bill, we are expecting a guest shortly. Thomas will be joining us to discuss some important family business." Right on cue, the doorbell rang. Julia flinched at the sound. My mother rose wordlessly to answer it, returning moments later with Thomas Walker, his leather briefcase in hand. "Evening, everyone," Thomas said with a practiced smile. "Sorry to interrupt your family dinner. After Frank's call, I thought it best to come right away." He sat down in what had always been my grandfather's chair, placing his briefcase on the table beside him. No one objected to this small but significant usurpation. We continued eating in strained silence. Thomas declined food, instead accepting only a glass of water. I noticed my father and Thomas exchanging glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, after the longest 20 minutes of my life, my father put down his fork and looked directly at me. "Bill, we need to discuss the future of this family and this house." I nodded cautiously. "Yes, I have been wanting to talk about that. There are a lot of questions I have about grandfather's will, and..." He cut me off with a sharp wave of his hand. "This isn't about questions. This is about decisions that have already been made. Your mother and I have been patient, but it's time for you to move on with your life." "Elsewhere?" I stared at him, not comprehending at first. "Move on? Elsewhere?" My father reached into his pocket and placed a white envelope on the table, sliding it toward me. "Your final notice." With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope. Inside was a check for $3,000 and a typed letter informing me that I was to vacate the premises immediately and permanently. "This is a joke, right?" I looked around the table, waiting for someone to break character, to tell me this was some kind of twisted prank. Nobody spoke. Nobody smiled. My father leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "Leave the key and do not come back. This house was never yours." My mother, finally looking at me, nodded in agreement. "We have indulged your presence here long enough." I turned to Julia, my little sister, hoping for some sign of the bond we once shared. Instead, she stood up and left the room, returning moments later with a suitcase. My suitcase, I realized with growing horror. She placed it beside my chair. "We packed what you will need for the next few days," she said softly. "The rest of your things will be sent to you once you provide an address." They had planned this. All of them. The dinner, the suitcase, the envelope. This wasn't a spontaneous decision. It was an orchestrated eviction. "You can't be serious," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I have lived here my entire life. I have contributed financially for years. This is my home too." Thomas chose this moment to open his briefcase and withdraw a document. "Actually, Mr. Anderson, legally speaking, you have no claim to this property. I have here the deed and updated will of Harold Anderson, which clearly states that the property passes to Frank and Linda Anderson exclusively." I glanced at the document, immediately recognizing it as the same one I had seen in my father's office, the one that looked altered. "This isn't right," I said, my shock giving way to anger. "Grandfather would never have cut me out like this. That document has been tampered with." My father stood up so abruptly, his chair fell backward. "Enough," he shouted. "Your paranoid accusations are exactly why this needs to happen now. You have 30 minutes to collect any additional items and leave. After that, we will consider anything left behind as abandoned property." My mother remained seated, her eyes now fixed on some middle distance, as if she couldn't bear to look at either me or my father. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling numb beneath me. "Why?" I asked simply. "What did I do to deserve this?" For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something guilt, perhaps in my father's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by cold resolve. "Family is about trust and loyalty, Bill. You have demonstrated neither. We have our reasons. That is all you need to know." In a daze, I went upstairs to my childhood bedroom. Most of my belongings had already been packed away. The walls were bare where my posters and photographs had once hung. My desk had been cleared of the computer setup I used when working from home. It was as if they had been systematically erasing me from the house for weeks, room by room, memory by memory. I added a few items to the suitcase, my grandfather's watch that he had given me on my 21st birthday, a photo album of us fishing together, a few personal documents I didn't trust them to send later. When I came back downstairs, the dining room was empty, except for my father, who stood by the front door, holding it open. My mother and Julia were nowhere to be seen. "Your keys," he said, extending his hand. I removed the house key from my key ring, the same key I had carried since I was 12 years old. The weight of it in my palm felt suddenly significant, as if I were holding a physical piece of my identity. "You will regret this," I said quietly, placing the key in his outstretched hand. "Not because of anything I will do, but because grandfather would be ashamed of what you've become." His expression didn't change, but his hand closed around the key with unnecessary force. "Goodbye, Bill," he said, and closed the door behind me with a definitive click of the lock. I stood on the sidewalk, suitcase in hand, staring up at the house where I had grown up. Lights were on in various rooms, silhouettes moving behind curtains, life continuing without me, as if I had never been part of it at all. That night, as I checked into a cheap motel on the outskirts of Boston, I couldn't have known that in just 2 weeks, a simple phone call would change everything. The first few days after being expelled from my family home passed in a blur of disbelief and confusion. I stayed at the Lakeside Motel, a rundown establishment that charged by the week and asked few questions. My room smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap cleaning products, the complete opposite of the warm, wood-scented home I had grown up in. I tried calling my parents repeatedly during those first days. Each call went straight to voicemail. After the 10th attempt, I discovered they had blocked my number entirely. Messages to Julia met the same fate. It was as if an invisible wall had been erected between me and the family I had known my entire life. In desperation, I even drove by the house once, parking across the street and watching the familiar patterns of movement inside. My father's car in the driveway, my mother's silhouette watering plants in the front window. Life continuing without any apparent disruption. I considered knocking on the door, demanding answers, but something held me back, pride, perhaps, or the fear of another public rejection. On the 4th day, as my motel funds were dwindling, I received a call from Max Bennett, my college roommate who now worked as an architect in Cambridge. "Dude, where have you been?" he asked. "I have been trying to reach you for days about that basketball game." I broke down then, telling him everything, the strange behavior, the altered will, the family dinner that ended with me on the street. To his credit, Max listened without interruption, without judgment. "That's completely messed up," he said when I finished. "Look, my spare room is yours for as long as you need it. No discussion." I moved into Max's apartment that same day, grateful for the friendship that had endured since our university days. His spare room was small but clean, with a desk where I could set up my laptop and continue working remotely. My tech company had been understanding about my sudden need to work from home, though I had given them a sanitized version of events, citing family issues rather than complete familial excommunication. The stress took its toll on my professional life. Deadlines I would normally meet with ease became overwhelming challenges. During video meetings, colleagues commented on my haggard appearance, the dark circles under my eyes, evidence of sleepless nights spent replaying every interaction, searching for clues to explain my family's betrayal. Those nights were the hardest. Lying in an unfamiliar bed, staring at an unfamiliar ceiling, I would cycle through emotions: anger at my parents, concern for my seemingly brainwashed sister, and a deep, aching sense of loss not just for my home, but for the family I thought I had. What hurt most was the calculated nature of it all. The packed suitcase, the formal letter, the staged dinner. This was not a heat-of-the-moment decision. They had planned it meticulously, coldly, as if evicting a troublesome tenant rather than cutting off their son and brother. 2 weeks after moving in with Max, I began the process of trying to understand what had happened with my grandfather's will. Internet research could only take me so far. I needed professional guidance. "Bill, you need to get ahead of this," Max advised over beers one evening. "Whatever they are doing with your grandfather's estate, it sounds shady as hell. You need a lawyer." I knew he was right, but the thought of legal action against my own family made me physically ill. These were the people who had raised me, who had attended every school play and graduation, who had taught me to ride a bike and drive a car. How had we arrived at a place where lawyers and courts seemed the only recourse? Still, I began gathering what evidence I could. Bank statements showing my regular contributions to household expenses, text messages, and emails referencing my grandfather and his intentions for the family home. Photos of the document I had glimpsed in my father's office, though they were too unclear to be of much legal value. A breakthrough came when I remembered Eleanor Simmons, my grandfather's oldest friend and former business partner. They had started the construction company together in the 1960s, and she had been a fixture at family gatherings throughout my childhood. After Harold's death, however, she had stopped receiving invitations, another casualty of whatever revisionist family history my parents were constructing. I found her living in a retirement community in Brookline. Despite being in her 80s, Eleanor's mind was sharp, her memories of my grandfather vivid and detailed. "Of course Harold wanted you to have the house," she said when I explained the situation. "He told me so explicitly at Thanksgiving, just months before he passed. Said he was updating his will to make sure of it." "Why me?" I asked. "Why not my father or Julia?" Eleanor smiled sadly. "Harold loved all of you, but he worried about your father. Frank always had expensive tastes and poor judgment with money. And Julia, well, Harold adored her but knew she was too easily influenced by your parents. You were different, independent, responsible, like Harold himself." Her words provided emotional validation, but little legal help. I needed concrete evidence of my grandfather's true intentions. With Eleanor's encouragement, I sought out Amanda Ferguson, a lawyer specializing in estate disputes. Her office was small but immaculate, with degrees and certifications covering one wall. Amanda herself was direct and unflashy, which I appreciated after my interactions with the slick Thomas Walker. "Based on what you've told me, there are red flags all over this situation," she said, after listening to my story. "But challenging a will is complex, especially without access to the original documents. Our first step is to obtain a copy of the will as filed with the probate court." I left her office with a plan and, for the first time since that fateful dinner, a sense of purpose. Even if I couldn't reclaim my place in the family, perhaps I could at least understand why I had lost it. The probate court records revealed our first significant clue. The will on file, dated 6 months before my grandfather's death, did indeed leave the house to my father. However, the court clerk mentioned something unusual. There appeared to be 2 versions of the will in the system, with slightly different filing dates. When pressed, she explained, "Sometimes this happens when amendments are made or errors corrected, but typically, there should be clear documentation of any changes." Amanda seized on this inconsistency. "We need to find out if there was an earlier version of this will and what exactly changed between versions." Our next step was to contact the notary public, whose stamp appeared on the will. This proved challenging, as the notary, a Martin Delaney, had apparently relocated to Florida shortly after my grandfather died. Another convenient disappearance in this increasingly suspicious narrative. As Amanda pursued legal avenues, I decided to follow another hunch. My grandfather had been a meticulous record keeper, maintaining accounts at several financial institutions. If he had updated his will, perhaps there would be records of his intentions at his longtime bank. I visited First National Bank, where Harold had been a customer for over 50 years. The branch manager was new and initially reluctant to discuss a deceased client's accounts with me. But when I mentioned potential irregularities with Harold's will, his demeanor changed. "Let me see what information we have on file," he said, disappearing into a back office. Little did I know that this routine inquiry would set in motion the events that would finally expose the truth and turn my world upside down once again. I was preparing dinner in Mac's apartment when my phone rang, an unfamiliar number with a local area code. Normally, I might have let it go to voicemail, assuming it was yet another spam call about my car's extended warranty. But something compelled me to answer. "Is this William Anderson?" a female voice asked. "Yes, this is Bill," I replied cautiously. "Mr. Anderson, my name is Sarah Donovan. I'm calling from First National Bank regarding an urgent matter concerning the Harold Anderson Trust. Are you able to come to our main branch tomorrow morning?" My heart began racing. The Harold Anderson Trust? This was the first I'd heard of any trust in my grandfather's name. "Yes, of course," I managed to say. "Can you tell me what this is about?" "I prefer not to discuss details over the phone," she replied. "But this matter concerns you directly, and our records indicate you haven't been in contact with us as expected." I agreed to meet her at 10 the next morning, then immediately called Amanda to update her on this development. "A trust? This changes things," she said thoughtfully. "Trusts operate differently from wills. They can transfer assets without going through probate, which might explain some of the confusion. I'll clear my morning schedule and join you at the bank." I barely slept that night, my mind racing with possibilities. What was this trust? Why hadn't anyone mentioned it before? Could it somehow explain my family's bizarre behavior? The next morning, Amanda and I arrived at First National Bank's imposing downtown headquarters 15 minutes early. The marble lobby and mahogany desks spoke of old money and discretion, qualities my grandfather had always valued. We were shown to a conference room where Sarah Donovan, a smartly dressed woman in her 50s, waited alongside an older man introduced as Richard Martinez, the bank's trust department manager. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Anderson," Martinez began, his tone formal but not unfriendly. "We have been attempting to locate you for several weeks now, ever since the triggering conditions of your grandfather's trust were met." Amanda leaned forward. "What triggering conditions are we talking about?" Martinez consulted a thick folder before him. Harold Anderson established a rather unusual trust arrangement. The primary asset of property at 1225 Maple Street in Lexington was to be held in trust for his grandson, William Anderson, but would appear to remain in his son Frank's control until certain conditions were met. I interrupted, unable to contain myself. 1225 Maple Street, that's my family home. The one I was recently asked to leave. Martinez and Donovan exchanged glances. "That explains a few things," Martinez said. "According to the terms of the trust, the property was to transfer fully to your ownership upon either your 30th birthday or when you were, and I quote, unjustly removed from the family home, whichever came first." I sat back, stunned. Grandfather had anticipated this. Somehow, he had known what my parents might do, and had created a legal safeguard. "There must be some mistake," I said. My parents showed me a will, leaving everything to them. Martinez shook his head. The will they showed you was likely the public document. But Harold created this private trust 3 months before his death, with our bank as the trustee. He was quite explicit about his concerns that your father might attempt to circumvent his wishes. Donovan slid a document across the table, an original trust agreement with my grandfather's unmistakable signature. In addition to the house, the trust contains liquid assets of approximately $1.7 million, she explained. Harold was quite successful in his investments during his later years. I felt the room spinning around me. Not only had my grandfather left me the house, but also a substantial fortune I had known nothing about. Amanda, ever the professional, asked the key question. Do you have the original will as well? Indeed we do, Martinez confirmed. Harold left it in our secure storage with instructions that it only be produced if the trust was challenged. He was, as you might imagine, very thorough. The original will, dated just weeks before my grandfather's death, told the true story. While he had left substantial sums to my father, mother, and Julia, the family home had always been intended for me, along with the bulk of his investment portfolio. It was as if my grandfather had reached across time to protect me, anticipating the betrayal that would come. But why? I asked, still struggling to process everything. Why would my family do this? Why go to such lengths to cut me out? The answer came the following week, after Amanda filed emergency petitions with the probate court. Thomas Walker, cornered by the ironclad evidence from the bank, broke attorney-client privilege to save himself from potential disbarment or worse. Your father has been in financial trouble for years, he admitted during a deposition. Bad investments, gambling debts. When Harold died, Frank saw an opportunity to solve his problems by taking control of the entire estate. He believed that if you were removed from the picture completely, the trust might never come to light. The court proceedings that followed revealed the full extent of my father's deception. He had created a falsified will using a document preparation service and a fraudulent notary stamp. He had withdrawn funds from family accounts to pay pressing debts. He had even taken out a second mortgage on the house, a house that, legally, he had no right to encumber. My mother, it emerged, had gone along with the scheme out of fear and misplaced loyalty. Julia had been manipulated with lies about my character and intentions, told that I planned to sell the house and leave them homeless once I gained control. The confrontation at the lawyer's office was both terrible and cathartic. My father, faced with incontrovertible evidence of his fraud, alternated between rage and desperate justification. Everything I did was for this family, he shouted across the conference table. Bill's just like Harold, always thinking he's better than everyone else. That house should have been mine by right. My mother sat silently weeping, unable to meet my eyes. Only Julia attempted any real communication, passing me a note before being ushered out by our parents. I didn't know the truth, it read. I'm so sorry, Bill. The legal process moved swiftly after that. The court invalidated the fraudulent will, recognized the trust as the governing document for my grandfather's estate, and issued orders preventing my parents from removing any further assets from the property. Criminal charges for fraud and document falsification were considered, but I chose not to pursue them. Despite everything, these people were still my family, however broken. 6 weeks after that first call from the bank, I stood on the sidewalk again, looking up at the Victorian house where I had grown up. But this time, I held more than a suitcase. I held a court order and a set of new keys, provided by a locksmith who had changed every lock at the court's direction. My parents had been given 48 hours to vacate, taking only personal belongings. They had done so in the middle of the night, leaving no note, no message, just empty spaces where family photos had once hung. As I walked through the front door, as the legal owner of my grandfather's legacy, the house felt both familiar and strangely new. Empty of the tension and deception that had filled it for so long, it awaited a fresh start. My fresh start. That night, sitting in my grandfather's old office, now cleared of my father's possessions, I found an envelope taped to the bottom of the desk drawer. Inside was a handwritten letter from Harold, dated just weeks before his death. "Dear Bill," it began, "if you're reading this, then things have probably gone exactly as I feared they might. Your father was always too much like his mother, ambitious, but with poor judgment. I hope the arrangements I've made have protected what matters. The house isn't just walls and a roof, it's our family's history, our legacy. Now it's yours to continue, in your own way. Trust yourself, as I have always trusted you. With love, Grandfather." I held the letter to my chest, and, for the first time since this ordeal began, allowed myself to weep, not just for what I'd lost, but for what Harold had preserved for me against all odds. The transition from homeless outcast to homeowner happened so quickly that it took months for the reality to fully sink in. The first few weeks in the house were surreal. I would wake up in my childhood bedroom, momentarily disoriented, half expecting to hear my father's footsteps in the hallway or my mother's voice calling me for breakfast. Instead, there was only silence, broken occasionally by the creaking of the old house settling on its foundation. I was now the sole owner of not just the Victorian home, but also the substantial trust my grandfather had established. The financial security should have been comforting, but the circumstances cast a shadow over everything. Wealth obtained through the exposure of family betrayal felt tainted somehow. My parents had moved to a condo in another part of the state. We had no contact. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard they were telling people they had chosen to downsize, making no mention of courts or fraudulent wills. My father had taken a position at a smaller accounting firm. My mother had started volunteering at a local library. They were rebuilding their lives without me in them. The hardest part was dealing with the emotional aftermath. The sense of betrayal ran deep. These were the people who had taught me about honesty and integrity, the same people who had conspired to defraud me of my inheritance. The cognitive dissonance was almost physically painful. How do you reconcile the parents who attended every Little League game with the ones who packed your belongings while plotting to throw you out? At night, I would sometimes sit in my grandfather's office, now mine, trying to feel his presence, seeking guidance. The space still held echoes of him, the faint smell of his pipe tobacco, the worn spot on the leather chair where he would rest his elbow while reading. In those quiet moments, I found some measure of peace, imagining what advice he might offer. 3 months after moving back in, I received an unexpected visitor. Julia stood on my doorstep, nervous and uncertain, nothing like the confident sister I had known. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I let her in, leading her to the kitchen where we had shared countless meals as children. The tension between us was palpable as we sat across from each other at the table. "I didn't know," she began, tears welling in her eyes. "Dad told me you were planning to sell the house once Grandfather died, that you didn't care about family history or keeping us together. He showed me emails that I now know were fake." I listened as she described the elaborate lies our parents had constructed, the way they had systematically turned her against me while presenting themselves as victims of my supposed greed and indifference. "I believed them because they were our parents," she said, wiping away tears. "Why would they lie about something like that?" Why indeed? That question had haunted me for months. Julia and I talked for hours that day, beginning the slow, painful process of reconstructing our relationship from the ruins of our parents' deception. It would take time, and there would always be scars, but that first conversation opened a door I had feared was permanently closed. The house itself needed attention. Years of neglect had left it shabby in places, with outdated systems and worn finishes. Rather than seeing this as a burden, I embraced the renovation as a form of therapy. Each repaired floorboard and freshly painted wall became a step in reclaiming the space, transforming it from a site of betrayal to something new that honored my grandfather's legacy while reflecting my own vision. Max was an invaluable support during this period, spending weekends helping me with renovation projects, bringing pizza and beer, filling the empty house with laughter. My lawyer Amanda became a friend as well, offering practical advice about managing the trust and protecting my assets going forward. 6 months after regaining the house, I joined a support group for people who'd experienced family estrangement. The stories I heard there helped me realize I wasn't alone. So many others were navigating similar pain, trying to rebuild their sense of self after familial betrayal. In one session, a therapist said something that resonated deeply. Family is supposed to be about unconditional love, but sometimes it's more about power and control. Recognizing the difference is the first step toward healing. That insight led me to a decision. I would use part of my inheritance to establish a scholarship fund in my grandfather's name, helping young people from troubled family backgrounds pursue education in engineering and construction, the fields he had loved. It felt right to transform something born of conflict into a force for good. The first anniversary of my eviction arrived on a crisp autumn day. Instead of dwelling in painful memories, I invited Max, Amanda, and a few close friends to the house for a rebirth celebration. We planted a young oak tree in the backyard, a symbol of new beginnings and deep roots. That same week, I received an email from Julia. She was engaged and wanted me to meet her fiancé. It was a small step, but a significant one. We were creating a new kind of family connection, one based on choice rather than obligation. The healing wasn't linear. There were still days when anger would surface unexpectedly, when a random memory would trigger a wave of grief for the family I had lost. But those moments became less frequent, less overwhelming. 2 years after the bank call that changed everything, I finally cleared out the last of my parents' belongings from the attic. Among the boxes was a photo album I had never seen before, filled with pictures of my grandfather and me fishing trips, baseball games, graduations. He had documented our relationship separate from the rest of the family, as if knowing these memories would someday need preservation. In the back of the album was another note from him, this one brief but powerful. Remember, Bill, a house is made of walls and beams. A home is made of love and dreams. Build yours wisely. Those words became my mantra as I continued to rebuild not just the physical structure around me, but my understanding of what family truly means. I learned that family isn't always defined by blood or legal documents. Sometimes it's the friends who show up with toolboxes and pizza. Sometimes it's a grandfather who plans beyond his own life to protect you. Sometimes it's the sister finding her way back through honesty and effort. The deepest lesson from this painful journey was that true family can never be erased from your life, even when the people who should embody that concept fail you. True family exists in the connections we nurture, the trust we build, the honesty we practice even when it's difficult. My grandfather understood this. His final gift wasn't just the house or the money, it was the wisdom to recognize that family is something we create through our actions, not something we're simply born into by chance. Today, the house on Maple Street stands renewed, its Victorian details restored, its systems modernized, its spaces filled with new memories and possibilities. And I stand renewed as well, no longer defined by betrayal but by the strength found in its aftermath. Have you ever experienced a betrayal that ultimately led to something positive in your life? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes our greatest growth comes from our deepest wounds. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life experiences. Share this with someone who might need to hear that family is about actions and love, not just blood and obligation. Thank you for joining me on this journey of healing and rediscovery. Remember, sometimes what feels like an ending is really just the first page of a better story.